Good morning, everybody. Sorry about that. Getting some things done there. This is the Mack Church of Christ, Sunday, Samuel the Chronicle study. We're in 1 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1. My name is Mike, and I hope the Lord's blessing you and keeping you as we together strive to do his will. As we're taking a look here at the outline that I always give you of the book of Samuel, notice that we're in 1 Samuel, and we had previously talked about in the first 9 chapters about Saul's birth, his calling, the fact that he became judge, the fact that Eli and the priesthood and the Ark of the Covenant had been basically, well, not the Ark of the Covenant, but the priesthood had basically been destroyed. Eli was killed and his sons were killed, and the Ark of the Covenant was taken by the Philistines, and the Philistines returned it. And then Israel asked for a king, and so that's where we're at. Saul had just become appointed king, or at least he was installed as king by Saul, and by Samuel. And so we're in here, we're at about verse 11, or chapter 11 today, speaking about what happens as he becomes king, because you remember in the last part of chapter 10, what happened was that, the thing that happened in the last part of chapter 10 was that some of the people accepted him as their king and others rejected him. And if you notice here in verse 27 of 1 Samuel 10, it says, verse 27 says, "But certain worthless men said, how can this one deliver us? And they despised him and did not bring him any presents, but kept silent." And so there's, as in all elections, you might say, there's a little bit of dissension between the ranks, and that's what you have there. There's this dissension that some people are looking at Saul and they're wondering, how can he deliver us? Because he's from this kind of small, insignificant tribe. And so they're wondering how he's going to be able to do that for them, or whether he even can do that for them. And so there's that disagreement. So that's the way it ends. That's the way chapter 10 ends. And now we have chapter 11 and verse 1. It says, "Now Nahash, the Amorites, came up and besieged Jabesh Gilead. And all the men of Jabesh said to Nahash, 'Make a covenant with us and we will serve you.' But Nahash, the Amorite, said to them, I will make it with you on this condition, that I will gouge out the right eye of every one of you. Thus I will make it a reproach on all Israel." The elders of Jabesh said to him, "Let us alone for 7 days, that we may send messengers throughout the territory of Israel. Then if there is no one to deliver us, we will come out to you." Now, I want you to notice a couple of things here as these Ammonites come out. This was one of the tribes that God had told Abraham that he was going to destroy, that the Israelites were supposed to destroy when they went into the land of Canaan. But remember that the book of Judges says they didn't destroy all of the nations, or at least not the entire 7 nations. They might have destroyed some of the 7 nations, but there were some remnants that were left, and they were going to be a thorn in the side of Israel during that time, if you remember, according to the book of Judges. And so here we have the Ammonites, and so the Ammonites come up and they besiege Jabesh Gilead. And basically what they say is that the men of Jabesh Gilead say, "Make a covenant with us and we will serve you." Now, it wasn't uncommon for Israel to have rulers over them that weren't Israelite, because these were the nations, and these 7 nations that they were supposed to destroy, that they didn't destroy all of them. Some of them would rise up and they would subjugate Israel. And remember that according to the book of Judges, that was being used by God for the purpose of chastising his people when they would depart from him. And so that's what we have going on here. So the Ammonites were coming up. And so Jabesh said, "Well, we'll make a covenant with you in order to serve you." And that happened a lot when a military power would come in, would subjugate the people. The people basically were allowed to live their lives, but they would be servants, or they would pay tribute to the nation under which they were controlled. And so that's kind of what you have on here. So when these men came up, rather than Jabesh Gilead looking for a fight and looking to go to war, they said, "Fine, well, make a covenant with us. Let us know your agree. Let us know what you want, and we'll serve you if you want. And in verse 2 it says, but Nahash, the Ammonite, said to them, I will make it with you on this condition, that I will gouge out the right eye of every one of you. Thus I will make it a reproach on all Israel. And so basically what you have is that the Ammonites and Nahash, their leader, basically says to them, sure, we'll do that, but we're going to put out your right eye. We're going to gouge out the right eye of each of you. And that, of course, will make it more difficult for them to fight or to shoot or any of the things that, require us to have two eyes in order to do well. Now, they'd still be able to live, of course, with just one eye, but they'd have to give up one of their eyes in order for that to happen. And he says one of the reasons he's doing that, and Nahash says one of the reasons he's doing that, is he says, I will gouge out the right eye of each one of you. Thus, I will make it a reproach on all Israel. In other words, he was going to do that to prove his fierceness or his conquest to all of Israel. He was just at Jabesh Gilead, but he wanted to make an impact on all of Israel. And so he was going to do that in order to kind of set a precedence for when he takes over the rest of Israel. And so that's what he asked them. So what do they say? Well, verse 3 says, and the elders of Jabesh said to him, let us alone for 3 days, that we may send messengers throughout the territory of Israel. And then if there is no one to deliver us, we will come out to you. So basically what this says is that they're looking for somebody to deliver them. And if there's nobody to deliver them, then they will come out to you. Now, when it says we will come out to you, it doesn't necessarily mean that we will come out to you and allow you to gouge out our eyes. It could mean that they'll just come out and try to fight them. It could also be what's under consideration, but either way, we're not sure, because it really doesn't say one way or another whether the coming out to them was going to be to yield to their request or to come out and fight against them and try to resist them. But either way, they basically said, give us 7 days and let's see if we can't find somebody. Now, verse 4, it says, then the messengers came to Gibeah of Saul and spoke these words in the hearing of the people. And all the people lifted up their voices and wept. Now, behold, Saul was coming from the field behind the oxen, and he said, what is the matter with the people that they weep? So they related to him the words of the men of Jabesh. Then the Spirit of God came upon Saul mightily when he heard these words, and he became very angry. He took a yoke of oxen and cut these in pieces and sent them throughout the territory of Israel by the hand of the messengers, saying, whoever does not come out after Saul and after Samuel, so shall it be done to his oxen. Then the dread of the Lord fell on the people, and they came out as one man. He numbered them in Bezek, and the sons of Israel were 300,000, and the men of Judah 30,000. They said to the messengers who had come, thus you shall say to the men of Jabesh Gilead, tomorrow, by the time the sun is hot, you will have deliverance. So the messengers went and told the men of Jabesh, and they were glad. Then the men of Jabesh said, tomorrow we will come out to you, and you may do to us whatever seems good to you. The next morning, Saul put the people in 3 companies, and they came into the midst of the camp at the morning watch and struck down the Ammonites until the heat of the day. Those who survived were scattered, so that not 2 of them were left together. And so here, as he speaks about this battle that happens, notice that it says that the messengers come to Jabesh Gilead, to Gibeah of Saul. In other words, Saul's hometown. They come to Gibeah and they speak the words in the hearing of the people. That is what Nahash had said that the people of Jabesh Gilead had to do. And they spoke it to the people, and the people were weeping. Now, you might say, well, why are the people weeping? Because it doesn't apply to them. Well, it does, in the sense that Nahash was going to do this to all of Israel. He just started over here with Jabesh with Jabesh Gilead is where he started, but his plan was to come into all of Israel and conquer it, was basically what he was doing. And so as the people at as the people at Gibeah heard this, they also wept. And it says, in verse 5, that now behold, Saul was coming from the field behind the oxen. Now, what this tells you is that even though Saul had been appointed king, that he really didn't have all the trappings of the king and the kingdom that we associate with a king, and especially during monarchs. So he didn't have himself a special palace. He didn't have himself a special place for people to come and him to entertain foreign dignitaries. He didn't have a standing army. He really didn't have a whole lot. And a matter of fact, you see him here plowing his own field and coming behind his own oxen. And so the king was very, very small. And as such, he's pointing out that, or the writer's pointing out for us that it's not this well-organized, well set up, well fortified king and kingdom that we see. It's just Saul. He became king. God said he was king. And so after he was appointed king, he went back home and began doing what he usually does in taking care of his own property and his own family. So it says, now behold, Saul was coming from the field behind the oxen, and he said, what is the matter with the people that they weep? So they related to him the words of the men of Jabesh. And so they basically told him what was going on. And it says in verse 6, then the Spirit of God came upon Saul mightily when he heard these words, and he became very angry. So we see God's Spirit moving in Saul when he hears about the people of God. God's Spirit always moves in relation to his people, and in relation to activity that's going on with his people. God's Spirit always moves in order to act or in order to counter the activity that his people are going through if necessary. And so that's what you see here. And so since Saul is the king, the Spirit works through Saul mightily, and he heard these words and he became very angry. So he was upset. Now, I'm sure one of the reasons why he was angry was because nobody stepped up in order to help them. It's kind of like, I don't believe that Gibeah was the only territory where they heard this message, and none of the other places heard it. I believe that other people had heard it, and nothing had been done. Nobody had determined to help them. And so that made Saul angry, I believe. And not only that, but also that the Ammonites were coming up and wanted to basically subjugate Israel. Now, verse 7 says, he took a yoke of oxen and cut them in pieces and sent them throughout the territory of Israel by the hand of the messengers, saying, whoever does not come out after Saul and after Samuel, so shall it be done to his oxen. And so basically what Saul did was, you guys need to take note of what's happening to some of your people, and you need to come to their aid. A united people always comes to the aid of some of their people. That's what we're supposed to do. If, for example, if Mexico decided to invade Texas, all of the eastern states and the western states would come down to aid them because we're considered one people. And so apparently when the messengers had gone out, nobody had responded. And so that made Saul angry. And that's the reason why he cut up the oxen. I don't think he would have cut up the oxen if the people had responded and they said, oh yeah, let's go down there and help them. But they weren't acting like one people. And so therefore he had to take a little bit of initiative. And so he cut up that ox and sent the pieces out and basically said to them that they're going to suffer economic distress if they don't come out to help them, if they don't come out to fight. And this could be by two reasons. One is that if the Ammonites did come and conquer Israel, then certainly that would affect their financial standing, because they would have to pay tribute and no doubt give up some of their property and possessions. And so it'd be a financial loss to them. Or if Saul went out and actually defeated the Ammonites, then Saul would come back and would basically punish those people who rebelled and didn't come to aid, and would therefore somehow affect them in a monetary way. But either way, Saul was trying to demonstrate for them what was going to happen if they don't come and help. And so it says, so he cut up that ox. And by the way, if you remember a little bit later on in the Judges period, if you remember, one of the things that happened was that one of the men had cut up his concubine who had been basically raped and abused by men of Benjamin, and he cut up his concubine. He sent parts of her everywhere to the different tribes, so that they would come and fight against the wicked men of Benjamin, if you remember that story. And so that's kind of what you have here. Although Saul didn't cut up a person, Saul cut up an oxen to represent what would happen to them. And so it says, then the dread of the Lord fell on the people, and they came out as one man. So the threat itself that Ammon had put on Jabesh Gilead didn't cause them to fear, but it was the threat that would happen to them if they didn't come out that Saul had pointed out to them. And so it finally put the dread of the Lord in them. Now notice it put the dread of the Lord. That meant that they understood that Saul was somebody who was under the leadership of God. And so to not do what Saul said would be the same as not listening to God. And so that's why it says the dread of the Lord fell on them, because they understood that Saul was backed by the Lord. And if Saul said this was going to happen to you, then the Lord was with him. And so therefore, the dread of the Lord came on them. And so they decided they better come out. And so they came out as one man, which they should have done to begin with, which I believe is what made Saul mad. Some people are only faithful to the Lord when it doesn't require anything from them. But when it requires something from them, many times they're unwilling to do it or unwilling to contribute, and that shows their true colors. Now, verse 8 says, he numbered them in Bezek, and the sons of Israel were 300,000 men, and the men of Judah 30,000. So there were 330,000 together. Now it's interesting that they separated the numbers from Israel, the 10 northern tribes, with Judah, who was the southern tribe. And it's interesting that happens. And I'm not sure exactly why that happened, but nonetheless it did. And so Judah's recorded a little differently or individually. And so maybe it's because that's the territory, if I understand my geography right, where this was going on and where these things were happening. So he points out that not only was Israel coming out, but also Judah also would be an individual who would be needing to contribute men to the cause. Now, in verse 9 it says, they said to the messengers who had come, thus you shall say to the men of Jabesh Gilead, tomorrow by the time the sun is hot, you will have deliverance. So the messengers went and told the men of Jabesh, and they were glad. So basically what happened was, once the people came as one man, then these messengers who had come and had gone to all the places and basically had accumulated or assembled God's people, that those messengers then went back to Jabesh Gilead and told them that deliverance was coming for them tomorrow. Now, remember that these men that came out, these 330,000 men, weren't necessarily soldiers. They were simply farmers, and many of them probably didn't have swords or spears. They probably had just hoes and sickles and rakes and pitchforks and those kind of things, farming implements that they were using, because they didn't really have a standing army. And the Philistines really had kept them from having weapons of any kind. And so Saul told them to tell the men of of Jabesh Gilead that they're going to be delivered tomorrow. So the messengers went out and told the men of Jabesh, and they were happy, of course. Now, verse 10, then the men of Jabesh said, tomorrow we will come out to you, and you may do to us whatever seems good to you. So basically, the men of Jabesh went and told the Ammonites, okay, we'll come out tomorrow, and tomorrow you can do whatever you want to us, as if they were going to surrender to them. But of course, we understand that they were going to be delivered that day. And so this is probably a way for Jabesh to get the Ammonites out without them being necessarily ready for battle, but that they were going to come in basically as conquerors, you might say, and clean up. Now, verse 10 says, then the men of Jabesh said, tomorrow we will come out to you, and you may do to us whatever seems good to you. Verse 11. And the next day, Saul put the people in 3 companies, and they came into the midst of the camp, at the morning watch, and struck down the Ammonites until the heat of the day. Those who survived were scattered, so that not 2 of them were left together. And so basically what happened was they came and they fought against the Ammonites in 3 different companies. That means from 3 different directions. And so the Ammonites would have 3 different fronts on which they were having to fight, and they came into their camp. So it wasn't like they were set up and ready for fighting. They were basically, basically just doing the normal things that they usually do, thinking that day they were going to go out, or that later that day they were going to go out, and Jabesh was going to surrender to them. And so they hadn't prepared themselves for battle, really. And so when Saul came and his men came, he was able to defeat them. And it says he defeated them to such an extent that no 2 of them fled together. So the battle was pretty decisive. And Saul managed to rouse all the people and bring them to the battle. Now, verse 12. It says, then the people said to Samuel, who is he that said, shall Saul reign over us? Bring the man that we may put him to death. But Saul said, not a man shall be put to death this day, for today the Lord has accomplished deliverance in Israel. Then Samuel said to the people, come and let us go to Gilgal and renew the covenant there. So all the people went to Gilgal, and there they made Saul king before the Lord in Gilgal. There they also offered sacrifice and peace offerings before the Lord, and there Saul and all the men of Israel rejoiced greatly. So as a result of Saul's ability to arouse the people, and his ability to defeat militarily the Ammonites, then the people said to Samuel, who is he who said, shall Saul reign over us? Bring the men that we may put them to death. In other words, basically those men in the last part of chapter 10. Remember, we looked at chapter 10, in the very last part of chapter 10, after Saul had announced that God had appointed Saul king, after Samuel had announced that God appointed Saul king, the certain worthless men in verse 27 said, how can this man deliver us? And they despised him and did not bring him any presents, but he kept silent. And so basically what that shows us is that these men who didn't want him to be king over them, because they said, how in the world is he going to deliver us? Now that this deliverance has happened over here in 1 Samuel chapter 11, then all the people are saying, who were those people that said that? Look at how good a job basically Saul has done. Those men deserve to die because they weren't willing to follow him, you might say. But verse 13 says, but Saul said, not a man shall be put to death this day, for today the Lord has accomplished deliverance in Israel. So notice 2 things. Number 1, that Saul wasn't out for revenge. He wasn't out to destroy people just because they didn't think he was capable of being king. Saul started off pretty good. He started off rather humble and rather meek, and he gave credit to the Lord for the deliverance. So Saul didn't take credit for the deliverance for himself, but he said basically that he was just an instrument of the Lord, and it was the Lord who delivered Israel. And so therefore nobody was going to be put to death. So he was showing compassion. He was showing compassion for his people. I don't know if maybe this is also a type of when Jesus became king in Acts chapter 2. Remember that Jesus became king because he was rejected by Israel. So some in Israel, the majority of Israel rejected him, and they even killed him. And yet when he became king, and when he was offering entrance into his kingdom, those men who had killed him were some of the first who were given the opportunity to come in. God was not going to kill them and defeat them and destroy them. He was going to allow them to come in if they would just acknowledge his kingship or his rule. And that's why we have in Acts chapter 2 and verse 36, after Peter announced that Jesus was made Lord, that it said those who heard him were pierced to the heart and said to Peter and the rest of the apostles, "Brethren, what shall we do?" I'm sure they were worried about the fact that they had not supported the king, he who was going to be king. And so they were wondering what would happen to them and what they could do about the situation. And no doubt, they were kind of ready to hear the apostles say, "Well, you guys who killed him are going to be executed because you didn't believe him or trust him." But instead, what they found was if you just repent and you're baptized in the name of Jesus, then you can be forgiven and he'll accept you into the kingdom. And so that's what had to happen with these men too. These men had to repent and they had to accept Saul as king, and then they would be allowed to live in the kingdom and wouldn't be killed. And so there might be some similarity or some type that's involved there. But that's what we see here. And so rather than Saul destroying those enemies of his, he allowed them to be part of his kingdom if they would acknowledge that he, in fact, was the king that God appointed. And so it says in verse 13 that also Saul pointed out that he understood that the deliverance was accomplished by the Lord and not himself, that he was just an instrument. And we need to remember that in whatever we accomplish in our life or whatever's accomplished through us, it's really not us doing it, it's the Lord that's doing it. And we're just simply his instruments of accomplishing what it is that he wants done when it comes to our situations and the things that we do. Now, in verse 14, it says, "Then Samuel said to the people, 'Come and let us go to Gilgal and renew the covenant there.'" So, in other words, what Samuel said was, okay, now that everybody's in agreement with this appointment of God making Saul king, and everybody sees how effective he's going to be as king, then let's really go and renew the kingdom. He was already king, but they're going to go renew the kingdom. He basically what's going to happen is Saul is going to assume the position for the entire kingdom and not just for the town where he lives or for the tribe where he lives in Benjamin. Remember, he was Benjaminite, but that he was going to rule over all of Israel, all the kingdom, from the northern tribes to the southern tribes, from the east to the west. He was going to be king. And so that's the idea of going in and renew the kingdom there. They were once again going to anoint Saul, or at least re-anoint him, if you want to say that, and put him over all of the kingdom and all of the territory, and all of the territory would be there to accept him. And so that's how they were going to renew the kingdom. Now, verse 15 says, "So all the people went to Gilgal, and there they made Saul king before the Lord in Gilgal." So notice that it says all the people went. So it wasn't just Benjamin, it wasn't just Judah, but all the people. So all the kingdom came, and they had certainly a more majority approval than they did prior to that. Now, no doubt some people still didn't want to be king, because there's always those people, but it wasn't a noticeable group or a noticeable amount of people that didn't want him to be king. You might have a few here and there, But all in all, the nation was accepting him as king, and that's why it says all the people went to Gilgal. And there they made him king, and they did it before the Lord in Gilgal. Now, the idea before the Lord means according to the Lord's will is what's under consideration, because they didn't do things before the Lord unless the Lord was approving of those things. And so that's the idea. So since the Lord had appointed him to be king, they were basically going to accept him as king, and they were doing it as the Lord had directed. So it was before the Lord in Gilgal. And there they also offered sacrifices of peace offerings before the Lord. And there Saul and all the men of Israel rejoiced greatly. So when they inaugurated him, they made peace offerings. In other words, God had given them peace through Saul, and so they were offering peace offerings to the Lord. And so they were going to eat with the Lord, and they were going to eat with each other and with the king. And they were offering this offering of peace. And so it wasn't just peace with the Ammonites. It wasn't just peace with God. It was peace with the king. They were making peace all the way around. And so everybody was now going to be at peace and accept the king as their king. And of course, along with the king, they're accepting the Lord. And so it says, and there Saul and all the men of Israel rejoiced greatly. So the people all rejoiced, and the men of Saul rejoiced, and they instituted, or they installed, the new king. Now, as they're doing that, in chapter 12 and verse 1, it says, Then Samuel said to all Israel, Behold, I have listened to your voice in all that you said to me, and I have appointed a king over you. Now here is the king walking before you. I am old and gray, and behold, my sons are with you. And I have walked before you from my youth even to this day. Here I am, bear witness against me before the Lord and his anointed, whose ox have I taken, or whose donkey have I taken, or whom have I defrauded, whom have I oppressed, or from whose hand have I taken a bribe to build my eyes with it? I will restore it to you. They said, You have not defrauded us or oppressed us or taken anything from any man's hand. He said to them, The Lord is witness against you, and his anointed is witness this day that you have found nothing in my hand. And they said, He is witness. Then Samuel said to the people, This is the Lord who appointed Moses and Aaron, and who brought your father up from the land of Egypt. So now take your stand, that I may plead with you before the Lord concerning all the righteous acts of the Lord, which he did for you with your fathers. When Jacob went into Egypt and your fathers cried out to the Lord, then the Lord sent Moses and Aaron, who brought your father out of Egypt and settled them in this place. But they forgot the Lord their God, so he sold them into the hand of Sisera, captain of the army of Hazor, and into the hand of the Philistines, and into the hand of the king of Moab, and they fought against them. They cried out to the Lord and said, We have sinned because we have forsaken the Lord and have served the Baals and the Ashtoreth. But now deliver us from the hand of our enemies, and we will serve you. Then the Lord sent Jerubbaal and Bendan and Japheth and Samuel, and delivered you from the hands of your enemies all around you, so that you live in security. Now, I want to stop there, even though it's not the end of a paragraph. I want to stop there and cover some of the stuff that he's mentioned before it leaves our mind. So it says in verse 1, then Samuel said to Israel, Behold, I have listened to your voice in all that you have said to me, and I have appointed a king for you. So Samuel basically reminds them that they asked for a king, and Samuel gave them a king. And of course, when Samuel says, I've given you a king, that means according to the Lord's will, because Samuel was basically the Lord's prophet. And so when Samuel would do something, that would be the Lord doing it for them, especially when it comes to the nation as a whole. Verse 2. Now here is your king walking before you, but I am old and gray, and behold, my sons are with you, and I have walked before you from my youth even to this day. And so basically, what Samuel is saying is that he is appointed a king, which is what they wanted. So now it's basically what he's saying is now you have your king, and therefore you're not going to need me, because the king is basically going to take the place of the judge. Because you remember that in their day and time, judges were individuals who were military leaders who would lead them into victory over those nations that would subjugate them from time to time. And so basically what Samuel is saying is, you're not going to need me anymore because you now have a king. So you have this king, and he just demonstrated to you his effectiveness by the defeat of the Ammonites. And Samuel also points out that he's getting old. He says, I'm gray. In other words, that he's getting old and up in years, and therefore won't be able to be as active as he was before. And it says, and behold, my sons are with you. Now, when he says my sons are with you, I don't think that he's complimenting his sons or telling them that you can rely on his sons. I really believe what he's saying is, because remember that Samuel's sons were corrupt because they took bribes. But I believe what he's saying is that, you do what you need to with my sons. My sons are before you. So you do with them what you want. But as for me, he says, I have walked before you from my youth even to this day. Here I am, bear witness against me before the Lord and his anointed. Whose ox have I taken, or whose donkey have I taken, or whom have I defrauded? In other words, Samuel's saying, look, you don't need me anymore, and you can deal with my sons the way you want to. But as for me, you know that I've been honest with you. I haven't stolen anything. I haven't taken anybody's donkey. I haven't defrauded anybody. I haven't lied, in order to get something. I haven't made myself rich through by the oppression of other people. I haven't taken bribes that have blinded my eyes. Now his sons did, and everybody knew it, but Samuel didn't. And so he basically says that he hadn't defrauded anybody, taken anything, and if by some chance he did, that he would certainly restore it and give it back if they would point out to him what it was that he had taken. And certainly that's what Christians do, is when we defraud somebody, we should definitely try to make amends and restore what we've taken from them, if possible, as God would want us to. Now, in 1 Samuel 12 and verse 4, it says, and they said, you have not defrauded us or oppressed us or taken anything from any man's hand. So Samuel wasn't in it for the money. He never was somebody who was motivated by money. Now, certainly he had what he needed, I'm sure, but it doesn't tell us that he was somebody who was rich or got rich off the people. So he wasn't overly concerned about money, and he certainly hadn't defrauded anybody. Now, compare Samuel with some of the Pharisees and Sadducees that Jesus talks about in Matthew chapter 23, and how for pretense they have long prayers and they devour widows' houses. See, they take advantage of people religiously. Religion is certainly a way that people can take advantage of other people, because people are willing to give and sacrifice for their God, and many people assume that that's speaking about their religion, and so they're willing to sacrifice. And many a preacher or an elder or a leader of a church has become rich by basically abusing and taking advantage of the people that are in his group, and we see that quite often. And some people in my day and time have gone to jail because they've embezzled other people's money religiously. But when it came to Samuel points out that he hadn't done that, and that he hadn't defrauded anybody. And if he did, he certainly would give it back. And so all the people are saying, you're right, Samuel, you haven't. We have nothing against you. There's nothing bad that you've done. There's no reason for us to speak ill of you or bad of you, because you have taken nothing from or anything from any man's hand. Now, in verse 5, it says, he said to them, the Lord is witness against you, and his anointed is witness this day, that you have found nothing in my hand. And they said, he is witness. And so basically, Samuel says that I don't possess anything right now immediately that belongs to somebody else, that I stole from somebody else. And so we're going to ask the Lord to be a witness of this. And the people said, fine, the Lord can be a witness of this, and that we haven't found anything that you stole or taken advantage of anybody. Now, I'd suggest to you that this is a form of swearing, because swearing is that you call somebody else who's greater than you as a witness. For example, somebody says, I swear to you on my mother's grave. The idea is that your mother's grave is greater and more respected than you, and so therefore you wouldn't do whatever it is that you promised not to do. And so here, basically, Samuel was swearing before the Lord. He said, we're going to do this before the Lord so that the Lord can be a witness of these things. And so they found nothing in his hand. And so Samuel said, okay, the Lord's a witness of this, that what you said today. Now, verse 6. Then Samuel said to the people, it is the Lord who appointed Moses and Aaron and who brought your fathers up from the land of Egypt. So Samuel's going to point out what it is that God has done for Israel, not what Samuel did for them or what leaders did for them, but what God did for them. What Samuel is showing them is that even though God appointed a leader for them, just like Moses was their leader, it was God who did everything. God was the one who delivered them out of Egypt. God was the one who brought them up to the mountain. God was the one who who parted the Red Sea. God was the one who did all those things. And though he was using Moses, it was God. And so the idea is, since you have a king, don't get into the mistake or the assumption that the king is doing this because of how smart he is and how capable he is and how intelligent he is. He's going to be able to do what God wants him to do because God is with him. And we need to remember that for each of us, that if we will stick close to the Lord, then we will be fruitful and productive. As Jesus says to the disciples, that he is the vine and they are the branches. If they stay closely connected to Jesus, then they'll be able to bear fruit. And that's what we have going on in this speech, that even though God gave them a king, it is God who's actually doing all the work, you might say, the heavy lifting. And that's why he points out that the Lord had appointed Moses and Aaron when he brought them into Egypt. And he said in verse 7, so now take your stand, that I may plead with you before the Lord concerning all the righteous acts of the Lord, which he did for you and your fathers. So even though Aaron and Moses were the leaders, it was God who was doing them. Verse 8 says, when Jacob went into Egypt and your fathers cried out to the Lord, then the Lord sent Moses and Aaron, who brought your fathers out of the land, out of Egypt, and settled them in this place. So notice that when Jacob, God's people in Egypt, cried out God, it was the Lord, it was the covenant God who sent Moses and Aaron. God's the one who sent the leaders. So the leaders of God's community are sent by God. He raises leaders for the purpose of being leaders, and he raises them. And so that's why in Romans chapter 12, it talks about the different gifts that God has gifted his people with for the benefit of blessing his people. And one of those is that you have leaders, that leaders are gifted. Not everybody's a leader, but not everybody needs to be a leader. And not everybody's meant to be a leader from the standpoint of a leader of a mass or group of people. We all certainly have the ability to influence and lead someone individually, but there are those who are leaders of people, and they can motivate, you might say, the masses. And so just like Saul did here, Saul motivated the masses by cutting up that ox. He understood what needed to be done and did it in order to motivate them. And so when he's talking about giving them a king, he's basically telling them that the Lord appointed their king. Now, he appointed their king the way they wanted it, but it was the Lord who did it. And even though the Lord wasn't necessarily pleased with the fact that he needed to appoint a king, God did do it, and it was God who did it. And therefore, they need to realize that God is behind the king, or that the king is being used by God. And so that's why he says that I may plead with you before the Lord concerning all the righteous acts of the Lord, which he did to our fathers. So in verse 8, it says that as a result of the leaders that God sent, he called them out of Egypt. And so they came out of Egypt. And now it says in verse 9, but they forgot the Lord their God. So he sold them into the hands of Sisera, captain of the army of Hazor, and into the hand of the Philistines, and into the hand of the king of Moab, and they fought against them. Now, this wasn't all done at the same time. What Samuel is telling them is, remember your history. Remember that in your history, the Lord allowed Sisera, the Lord allowed Hazor, the Lord allowed the Philistines, and the Lord allowed the Moabites. And just recently, the Lord had allowed the Ammonites to come up against them, because God said that he was going to use those nations to chastise Israel whenever Israel wasn't faithful. And so he's reminding them about those people that God brought up against them, those nations that God brought up against them. And he says in verse 10, and they cried out to the Lord and said, we have sinned because we have forsaken the Lord and have served the Baals and the Ashtoreth. So basically what happened is, remember that during the judges, Israel didn't have a king, and so they would cry out to God and they would repent. The reason that Hazor, the Moabites, Sisera, and the Philistines, and all of those nations were able to subjugate sections of Israel was because those sections had given themselves over to idolatry, to Baals and to Ashtoreth. And he says, but now deliver us from the hand of our enemies. So they would cry out to God. They would cry to God for deliverance, and he and we will serve you. So basically, when their oppression gets so bad, they come to their senses and say, we need to go back to God, because we'll serve him and he'll take care of us. And so, the cycle of the judges always reminds me of the prodigal son. And it's really the cycle of spiritual growth, because just like in the prodigal son, he took everything the father gave and he went off and squandered it. And as he squandered it, he then began to think that if he just goes back to the father will take care of him and bless him. And the father's servants have better to eat than the prodigal son did when he was feeding swine, if you remember that. And so he returned and the father forgave him. Well, that's the same thing that goes on in the judges, with the exception that God has to send them a judge. But the judge is raised by God. That's who raises this judge. And that's what he's telling them about the king. That though they're getting a king, the king is empowered by God, and God is behind the king, and God is using the king. So it's actually God that's doing this for them, just like it was God who delivered them, when it says in verse 11, then the Lord sent Jerubbaal and Bedan and Japhan and Samuel, and delivered you from the hands of your enemies all around, so that you lived in security. So basically he said, you guys cried out to God, and God sent you judges. He sent you judges to deliver you so that you could live securely in the land. And so the point of all this is, yes, God appointed you a king, but don't put your hopes and your expectations of deliverance in the king. It's not in the king, just like it wasn't in the judges. It's in God. God's the one who's going to raise him. So if you will have kings that are faithful to God, then those kings, being instruments of God, will be able to deliver you and deliver the people so that they can live in security. And that's certainly the kingdom of Jesus. Jesus came, and Jesus, being a king, a divine king who understands God and who knows God because he is God, he then has a kingdom that's going to offer us security, it's going to offer us freedom, it's going to offer us the ability to live with him. And he's going to be secure. But it's God who raised up Jesus in order to do that, just like it's God who raised up the prophets, and just like it's God who's raising up this king. And so that's the point of this section. That's the thing that they need to remember, is that sometimes we because we live in this world by what we see many times takes over what we're thinking rather than the spiritual reality that's behind it, that we're supposed to trust in. And so oh, sorry, hit the wrong button. Sorry, hit the wrong book. Get back over to Samuel 12. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, now it says that as they were doing that, let me get back here to where I was. Okay. All right, and now in verse 12, as Samuel's continuing, he says, when you saw that Nahash, the king of the sons of Ammon, came against you, you said to me, no, but a king shall reign over us, although the Lord your God was your king. Now, therefore, here is the king whom you have chosen, whom you have asked for. And behold, the Lord has set a king over you. If you will fear the Lord and serve him and listen to his voice and not rebel against the command of the Lord, then both you and also the king who reigns over you will follow the Lord your God. If you will not listen to the voice of the Lord, but rebel against the command of the Lord, then the hand of the Lord will be against you, as it was against your fathers. Even now, take your stand and see this great thing which the Lord will do before your eyes. Is it not the wheat harvest today? I will call to the Lord that he may send thunder and rain. Then you will know and see that your wickedness is great, which you have done in the sight of the Lord by asking for yourselves a king. So Samuel called to the Lord, and the Lord sent thunder and rain that day. And all the people greatly feared the Lord and Samuel. Now we're going to stop there and cover this and notice what he says. So he's pointing out that it was God who delivered them from their captivity. And so when they saw Nahash, the king of Ammon, came up against them, they wanted a king to lead them. Like they had seen the nations have a king to lead them rather than a judge. They wanted a king. And so they asked for a king, and the Lord gave them your king. Although the Lord was their king, he did give them a king. Verse 13 says, now therefore, here is the king whom you have chosen. In other words, he's pointing to Saul. He says, here's the king you asked for. But behold, the Lord has set a king over you, but the Lord is really your king. That's what he's telling them now. He says, if you will fear the Lord and serve him and listen to his voice and not rebel against the command of the Lord, then both you and also the king who reigns over you will follow the Lord your God. So basically he says, if you trust the Lord, then you'll be able to follow the Lord and the Lord will lead you. The Lord will be the one guiding you. He'll be the one going in front of you. And that's the idea here. Even though they have a king, it's the Lord who leads the king and the Lord who goes in front of them and they follow after. The Lord has always been our shepherd, and the Lord is the shepherd of the world, and he's always shepherded the world. And the world should follow him, whether that's in the idea of his representative as being the king, or whether it's your parents who are, if they're faithful to the Lord, whoever it is that's ruling over us, who's faithful to the Lord, then we are being faithful to God. If we follow them as they're following the Lord. Now he says in verse 15, if you will not listen to the voice of the Lord, but rebel against the command of the Lord, then the hands of the Lord will be against you as it was against your father. Excuse me, as it was against your father. And so he basically gives them the opposite of that, and that is, if you don't follow me, if you don't follow God, then you aren't going to be secure, and you're not going to live peaceably, but it's going to go bad against you like it did against your fathers. Well, what happened with their fathers? Well, they were subjugated from time to time, and therefore therefore God would have to deliver them when they repented. And so that's what he's saying. He's saying, so the choice is yours. You can follow me, even though you have a king, and your king can follow me, and God will go in front of them, and you'll be to live securely. Or you can do what the nations do, and you can go after false idols, and God will cause you to be subjugated, and you won't be secure. Now, verse 16, even now, take your stand and see this great thing which the Lord will do before your eyes. So now, God is going to give them at this time a miraculous sign that what he's saying, or that what Saul is saying, is actually from God, and that it's God's command and God's will, and that God is the one who's going to lead them, and that even though they ask for a king, God is the one who's giving them one and allowing them to have this monarch. Now, here's what God's going to do in order to prove that what Samuel is saying is from God and not just from Samuel. Verse 17, is it not the wheat harvest today? So that would make it the summer months. He said, I will call to the Lord that he may send thunder and rain. Then you will know and see that your wickedness is great, which you have done in the sight of the Lord by asking for yourself a king. So basically, Samuel says that the Lord is going to thunder and rain at a time when it doesn't thunder and rain, to prove to you that you were acting unrighteously when you asked for a king, even though he gave you one. That you were acting unrighteously, and you were basically rejecting God from being your king to get them to repent and change. So verse 18 says, so Samuel called to the Lord, and the Lord sent thunder and rain that day, and all the people greatly feared the Lord and Samuel. So they all, after they saw this, they feared the Lord and they feared Samuel. And so as a result of that, Samuel was respected and God was feared. Now notice it didn't say they feared the king, it says they feared the Lord and Samuel. So they understood that the king that they appointed wasn't really the one who was leading them, but it was God who was leading them. And since Samuel was with God, then Samuel was leading them, you might say, or at least was speaking for God to them. And so they greatly feared, they had a great reverence for God and for Samuel. Now, verse 19. Then all the people said to Samuel, pray for your servants to the Lord your God, so that we may not die, for we have added to all our sins this evil by asking for ourselves a king. Samuel said to the people, do not fear, you have committed all this evil, yet do not turn aside from following the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart. You must not turn aside from then. You will go after futile things which cannot profit or deliver, because they are futile. For the Lord will not abandon his people on account of his great name, because the Lord has been pleased to make you a people for himself. Moreover, as for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by ceasing to pray for you, but I will instruct you in the good and right way. Only fear the Lord and serve him in truth with all your heart, for consider what great things he has done for you. But if you still do wickedly, both you and your king will be swept away. Now, we're not going to be able to finish all these verses, but I wanted to read them all to you so that you get the sense of what's going on. I just simply want to look at verse 18 here. Verse 19 here, and it says, Then all the people said to Samuel, pray for your servants to the Lord your God, so that we may not die, for we have added to all our sins this evil by asking for ourselves a king. So the people wanted to repent. They were going to repent of asking for a king. And so they were going to do this, and they didn't want to die, and they asked Samuel to pray for them. And so we're going to go ahead and stop there. We'll pick up verse 20 next week. I'm glad you're here. Pray the Lord blesses you. And sorry for a couple of the yawns that I had today. For some reason, I feel a little sleepy, although I slept well last night. Pray that God has blessed all of you and that all of you sleep well and that all of you are blessed during the day. Thanks for being here.